The sound of the offensive died here. It did not fade. It was severed. One moment, the world was a roaring symphony of diesel engines, grinding steel tracks, and the deafening shouts of men driving west. The next, there was only the low, wet whisper of the river and the chilling silence of impotent rage. The Dnieper. It was not a river. It was a flat, gray, mile-wide knife slash across the land. A geographical guillotine that had cleanly beheaded the momentum of an entire Soviet tank army. The western bank where they stood was chaos churned into mud. Dozens of T-34s, their formidable silhouettes now looking awkward and stranded, were scattered like toys abandoned in a hurry. They huddled under ragged camouflage nets, their long barrels pointing uselessly at the sky. These were not machines of war anymore. They were 30-ton monuments to frustration. The true horror, however, was not the stillness on this bank. It was the activity on the water. 500 meters downstream, a battalion of combat engineers was being systematically destroyed. Men, reduced to tiny, dark figures, fought the river up to their necks. The freezing water stole their breath and their strength. They struggled to heave wooden pontoons into a line, their movements sluggish with cold. Hammers rang against metal stakes, a sound thin and desperate against the vastness. From the opposite bank, invisible and patient, death responded. A distant, muffled crump echoed. Seconds later, a geyser of brown water and splintered timber erupted in the center of their work. A direct hit. No scream could be heard over the explosion, only a terrifying vacuum of sound before the wreckage rained down. A severed pontoon, spinning lazily, was carried away by the current. The men did not flee. They paused, numb, then moved forward again, grasping for the shattered remains. They were not building a bridge. They were feeding themselves and their work into a German artillery equation, with only one solution. On a command knoll overlooking this slaughter, Major Viktor Gromov felt the equation burning behind his eyes. He was an engineer. He thought in vectors, load capacities, and coefficients of friction. The human cost was a variable in his calculations, a variable that was now skyrocketing towards infinity. Next to him, Army General Volkov, a bear of a man whose neck seemed permanently thickened from a lifetime of shouting orders, lowered his field glasses. The glass lenses clicked softly against the brass rim. It was the sound of a final verdict. The staff officers around them offered data, and each datum was a nail in a coffin. Smoke screens would dissipate in the cross breeze. Night crossings would scatter the infantry into drownable fragments. A proper bridge would take 4 days. 4 days, Volkov stated, his voice a quiet, volcanic rumble, was enough for the Germans to bring up 2 fresh panzer divisions and turn the far bank into a steel-plated hell. The entire summer offensive, bought with 10,000 lives, would end right here, in this mud. Gromov's gaze was locked not on the general, but on a point below. One of the tank crews, desperate for better cover from aerial observation, was trying to maneuver their T-34. The driver gunned the engine. The V-12 roared, a powerful living sound alien in this place of watery death. The tracks bit deep, chewing through black soil and roots, flinging a fountain of earth high into the air. The tank lunged backwards, powerful, abrupt, a display of raw, kinetic energy. In Gromov's mind, a brutal collision of images occurred. The roaring tank, a concentrated burst of force. The graceful, deadly arc of an artillery shell he had watched 1,000 times. The shattered ramp of the railway bridge to the south, its broken end jutting into space. The pathetic, slow-motion annihilation of the men in the river. His engineering mind, trained to solve for X, began to work on a new, monstrous formula. It discarded the water as a factor. It treated the river not as a medium to cross, but as a dead space, a ditch. The problem ceased to be about buoyancy or bridge strength. It reformed itself into a question of ballistics, mass, velocity, launch angle, trajectory. The idea did not dawn, it detonated. It was a full system shock, so violent it felt physical. His stomach clenched. The sounds of the river, the distant explosions, the general's voice, all melted into a dull roar in his ears. He saw it, clear as a technical drawing etched on his retina. Not a bridge, a ramp. A thick, squat, obscenely strong wooden structure. The tank, at full throttle, hitting a precisely calculated incline. The moment of weightlessness. The 30-ton steel beast becoming a projectile. A brief, impossible flight. The catastrophic impact on the other side. It was not just madness. It was a heresy against every engineering principle. A joke a drunk sapper might tell. To speak it was professional suicide. It would mark him as a lunatic and coward looking for a way out of real work. He could see the cold dismissal in the general's eyes, the scornful smirks of the line officers. But then his eyes flicked back to the river. Another crump. Another geyser. Closer to the bank this time. He saw a soldier, just a boy, flung sideways into the water like a rag doll and not resurfacing. The equation in his head refined itself, cold and clear. The variable for human life on the pontoons was unsustainable. His idea, however insane, proposed a different calculus. One tank crew's risk against a battalion's certain death. A minute of flight against hours of massacre. Major Viktor Gromov took a breath that felt like inhaling ice shards. He turned from the river, from the drowning men, and faced General Volkov. His face was bloodless, his knuckles white around his map case. But when he spoke, his voice did not shake. It was flat, technical, devoid of all emotion, as if he were reporting a trivial measurement. Comrade General, all current solutions fail because they engage with the water. I propose we bypass the water entirely. We cannot cross it. Therefore, we must jump over it. He paused, letting the sacrilege hang in the air for a heartbeat. We take a T-34. We build a wooden launch ramp. We use its own power as the propellant. We calculate the trajectory, and we throw it across, as we would an artillery shell. The silence that followed his words was absolute. It was not the quiet of consideration, but the vacuum left by the collapse of reason. For 3 full seconds, the only sound was the distant, mocking ripple of the river. General Volkov did not move. His eyes, small and dark as river stones, remained fixed on Gromov's face, searching not for genius, but for signs of a breakdown. The staff officers froze, their expressions a gallery of stunned disbelief. One, a corpulent colonel from logistics, actually let out a soft, incredulous puff of air, as if he'd been lightly punched in the stomach. Then, the volcano erupted. Volkov's composure shattered. His face, already flushed, turned a deep, dangerous crimson. He took 1 step forward, and the ground itself seemed to tremble. The rant that erupted was not loud. It was low, guttural, and venomous, each word spat out like a piece of shrapnel. He did not address the idea. He attacked the man. He spoke of cowardice disguised as insanity. He spoke of the sacred trust of command, of the tons of steel and the lives of men entrusted to engineers, not to circus performers dreaming of flying elephants. He accused Gromov of looking for a fantastical way to evade the hard, bloody work that duty demanded. The word traitor was not spoken, but it hung, unuttered, in the frigid air between them. Gromov stood under the onslaught. He did not flinch. He absorbed the fury like a lightning rod, letting it earth itself through him. His mind, however, had detached. It was operating in a pure, crystalline space of stress and numbers. He understood the general's rage was not just personal. It was the rage of the situation itself, and he was merely its target. To respond with emotion was death. Only data could be his shield. When the general paused, breathing heavily, Gromov did not apologize. He did not justify. He simply turned, knelt in the mud, and with a gloved finger began to draw. He drew in the thick, black earth, a rough, schematic line for the river, a thick wedge on their side, the ramp, a parabola, clean and bold, arching over the river line, a small square on the far bank, the tank. The officers stared down, mesmerized in spite of themselves by this primal act of technical demonstration. Then, from his map case, he produced a notebook. Its pages were filled not with prose, but with dense, hurried calculations. He did not show them the book. He recited from it. His voice was a dry, numerical monotone, a stark contrast to the general's heat. He spoke numbers. The approximate weight of a combat-loaded T-34, the power-to-weight ratio of its engine, the coefficient of friction of seasoned oak planks, the optimal launch angle for maximum range with a controlled impact. He cited from memory the physics textbooks of his academy days, the principles of ballistic trajectories applied to artillery shells. He performed the mental alchemy of turning a tank crew into a set of variables: mass, velocity, vector. He addressed the unspoken horrors, the landing. He talked about energy dissipation, about the suspension of the T-34, arguably the most robust in the world, acting as a colossal shock absorber. He spoke of soil composition on the far bank, of the crater the impact would create, of how that very violence would serve as an instant defensive berm for the disembarked tank. He talked about the psychological effect on the enemy, not men crossing, but a steel avalanche materializing from the sky directly into their trenches. With each sentence, the idea shed its skin of pure madness. It did not become sane. It became something far more compelling, a calculated, engineered madness. It moved from the realm of a drunkard's fantasy into the terrifying territory of a non-standard solution. A heresy, but a heresy backed by mathematics. General Volkov's rage had cooled, replaced by a different, more intense emotion, the crushing weight of absolute responsibility. He looked from the madman in the mud to the carnage on the river, then to the paralyzed tanks. His strategic mind, trapped in a checkmate, began to probe Gromov's ludicrous proposition not as a fantasy, but as the only pawn left on the board. Finally he spoke, his voice now drained of all color. He outlined terms that were not an order, but a death sentence for Gromov's career, and possibly his life. There would be no resources diverted from the main effort. Gromov could have one company of sappers, the ones currently bleeding out on the pontoons. He could have whatever scrap wood and salvage he could find. He would have 3 days, not 4, 3. And for the test, he would have 1 tank, 1 crew, 1 single, irrevocable attempt. If the tank flew, landed, and remained combat capable, Gromov would receive what he needed. If it faltered, If it crashed into the river, if it shattered on impact, the consequences would be severe, not just for the crew, for him. The word sabotage was finally uttered, cold and clear. Wasting critical resources and a combat tank on a lunatic's dream during a time of crisis was an act bordering on treason. Gromov listened, and for the first time, a real human emotion broke through the shell of his focus. A profound, icy dread. He had not asked for this. He had only voiced a thought. Now, he was chained to it. He had gambled his future and the lives of others on a line drawn in mud and a column of numbers. He stood up, his knees stiff. He saluted. No words were exchanged. The acceptance was in the salute itself, a brittle, formal gesture. As he turned to leave the knoll, the atmosphere had shifted. The officers looked at him not with contempt now, but with a kind of morbid fascination. He was no longer just a coward or a lunatic. He was a man walking a tightrope over an abyss, and they were all suddenly spectators to a spectacle that was either about to become a legendary breakthrough or a grotesque historical footnote of failure. The weight of the unspeakable task settled on his shoulders. He had 3 days to turn a sketch in the dirt into a machine of flight. He had to find men who could build it, and others brave or desperate enough to ride it. The paper projectile had left the page. Now it had to be forged in wood, steel, and nerve. The sappers assigned to Major Gromov were not a construction crew. They were survivors, pulled from the riverbank, still dripping with icy water, and the psychic residue of watching their comrades turn into pink mist. They stood before him in a loose, shivering line, their eyes hollow, their uniforms plastered to their skin. They expected another suicide mission. They did not expect him to explain they would be building a catapult for a tank. The site chosen was a kilometer back from the front, in a dense, gloomy patch of birch and pine forest. It was a place of damp silence, the distant thunder of the front, reduced to a faint, ominous tremor in the earth. This would be their forge, not of swords, but of a single, absurdly large arrow. Gromov's first act was not to issue orders. It was to gather the men in a clearing, their breath smoking in the cold air. He did not give a rousing speech. He spread his mud-stained notebook on the stump of a felled birch. With a piece of charcoal, he began to draw on the pale, smooth wood of a fresh-cut log. He drew the ramp, not as an idea, but as a structure. Thick vertical supports, cross braces at precise, acute angles. The launch track itself, a steeply inclined plane. He explained its function not in terms of flight, but in terms of load and redirecting force. He spoke their language: shear strength, compression, foundation stability. He was not asking them to believe in magic. He was asking them to trust their axes, their saws, and their ability to tie a knot that would hold under 30 tons of screaming momentum. The disbelief in their eyes did not vanish, but it was joined by a flicker of professional interest. This was a problem. A monstrous, insane problem, but a problem of engineering. And they were engineers. A grizzled sergeant major, his face a network of old scars and new exhaustion, grunted, leaned closer, and pointed a thick, calloused finger at one of the proposed joints. "That will splinter," he stated flatly. Gromov nodded, erased the line with his thumb, and drew it differently. The collaboration had begun. The forest exploded with a new, frantic industry. The ring of axes replaced the ring of distant artillery. Great pine trees, centuries old, groaned and crashed to the forest floor. their fall shaking the ground in a practice run for the impact to come. Teams of men with two-handed saws worked in sweaty, synchronized rhythm, their breath coming in grunts, transforming trunks into heavy, raw timbers. The air grew thick with the smell of fresh sap, pine resin, and wet wool. Gromov was everywhere. He was no longer a major issuing commands from a distance. He was a foreman in the mud. He helped shoulder beams. He checked every notch and mortise with a carpenter's square he had procured from God knows where. His hands became slick with resin and blistered from rope. He moved with a frantic, obsessive energy, his eyes burning with a light that worried the men even as it drove them. He was not building a structure. He was conducting an exorcism, trying to force his vision into reality through sheer force of will. They scavenged like crows. A destroyed village on the edge of the woods yielded ancient, thick floor joists. A blown-up German supply column provided heavy-duty cargo straps. Every nail, every bolt, every piece of usable metal was pried from the wreckage of war and given a new purpose. The ramp began to take shape, and it was an ugly, brutal thing. It looked less like a piece of engineering and more like the skeletal rib cage of some prehistoric beast, something that belonged in a primeval swamp, not a 20th century battlefield. It was asymmetrical, made from mismatched timber, lashed together with ropes and reinforced with strips of torn armor plate from a gutted scout car. But it was strong. The men, their initial skepticism worn away by exhausting labor, began to take a grim, possessive pride in its monstrous strength. They would test sections by having a dozen of them jump in unison on a beam, and the structure would not shudder. The sergeant major would deliver a mighty kick to a support post and nod in grim approval. It was crude, it was overbuilt, it was terrifying. Yet, in the midst of this focused chaos, a shadow arrived. A captain from the special department, his uniform impeccably clean, his face an expressionless mask. He observed. He took notes in a small black book. He did not interfere, but his presence was a cold draft that cut through the sweat and toil. He was a walking reminder of the general's promise: sabotage. His eyes catalogued the diverted resources, the manpower, the gasoline for the saws, the precious metal fasteners. He was calculating the cost of this folly, preparing the indictment for when it inevitably failed. Gromov ignored him. He had to. On the evening of the second day, they conducted the first test. Not with a tank, but with a weighted sled, a crudely welded contraption filled with spare track links and rubble, approximating the tank's weight. They used a winch from a recovery vehicle to drag it at speed up a finished section of the track. The test was a disaster. The sled skewed, a supporting timber groaned and cracked like a rifle shot, and the whole structure shuddered violently. Men ducked for cover. The sled crashed off the side, burying itself in the mud. Silence fell, broken only by the creaking of strained wood. All eyes turned to Gromov. The special department captain's pencil hovered over his notebook. This was the moment of collapse. Gromov walked to the fractured beam, touched the splintered wood. He did not curse. He knelt, examined the angle of failure. He called the sergeant major over. They spoke in low tones about lateral stress, about the need for diagonal bracing on the outside, not just the inside. It was not a failure, he declared to the men, his voice cracking with fatigue, but utterly certain. It was data. They had learned something. They would reinforce. They would rebuild that section. That night, under the ghostly light of a shrouded moon, the work continued. Gromov did not sleep. The men, seeing his unwavering commitment or his terrifying descent into obsession, did not sleep much either. The forest forge glowed with the light of improvised lanterns, figures moving like ghosts against the monstrous growing silhouette of the ramp. They were no longer just following orders. They were invested. They had to see if the damned thing would work. They had to know if their labor and the shadow of the special department's judgment hanging over them all would end in triumph or in a spectacular, lethal disgrace. The machine was becoming a character in the drama, a wooden giant whose only purpose was to hurl another giant into the sky. The ramp was complete. It stood in a clearing now stripped bare of trees, a grotesque and formidable piece of architecture. It did not look designed. It looked grown, like a malignant wooden outcrop erupting from the earth. Its inclined plane, scarred by the test sled, pointed at a sharp, aggressive angle towards the gray sky. At its base, a long, muddy track had been cleared, a runway for madness. The structure seemed to hum with a latent, terrible potential. It was ready. Now it required its projectile. The news traveled through the immobilized tank brigades like a voltage shock. It was met not with enthusiasm, but with a profound, superstitious dread. The infantry had their frontal assaults, the pilots their dogfights, the artillerymen their deafening duels. All were terrifying, but they existed within a known spectrum of war. This was something else. This was a proposal to become not a soldier, but ammunition. To be loaded into the breech of a wooden cannon and fired. General Volkov's order was clear: a volunteer crew. No orders, no assignments. Only volunteers. It was a gesture that tasted cynical, a way for the command to distance itself from the coming horror. Who would volunteer for a test that sounded less like a military operation and more like a medieval witch trial by flying? For 2 days, no one came forward. Gromov, standing by his monstrous creation, felt a new kind of coldness seeping into his bones. He had fought the river, the laws of physics, the skepticism of his superiors, the exhaustion of his men. Now he faced the most intractable obstacle: the perfectly sane, self-preserving instinct of the tankers. His machine was a sculpture of futility. The breakthrough came from a loss so mundane it was crushing. A young lieutenant, barely 20, named Dmitry Koval. His T-34 Grom Thunder was not destroyed, but crippled. A broken final drive, a part that would take weeks to arrive. His crew, a tight-knit family of war, faced being broken up, sent as infantry replacements to the bloody meat grinder of the front line. The infantry trenches held a different, more statistically certain kind of death. Koval, a pragmatist with a calm, analytical mind, saw the numbers. He gathered his crew: Sasha, the bullish driver with an almost sensual connection to his machine; Misha, the loader, strong as an ox and devoutly superstitious; and Ilya, the gunner, a quiet former engineering student with a poet's eyes. Koval did not give them a speech about glory or duty. He laid out the grim calculus in the dark interior of their broken tank. Option 1, the trenches, a slow, muddy consumption. Option 2, the ramp, a single decisive moment of terror, a chance, however slim, to be the first, to land behind enemy lines not as infiltrators, but as a steel avalanche, to potentially survive, to perhaps even win. He presented it as a tactical choice, the only offensive option left to them. They were not volunteering for suicide, he argued. They were choosing their battlefield. They came to the clearing at dusk, a somber group. They did not look at Gromov with hope or anger. They looked at him like surgeons observing a strange, new procedure. Koval, his lieutenant's insignia tarnished, walked straight up to the ramp. He ignored Gromov and placed a hand on one of the massive, rough-hewn support beams. He knocked on it, listening to the solid, dead thump. He walked its length, studying the joints, the bracing, the angle of incline. His inspection was not that of a fearful victim, but of a co-pilot assessing a strange new aircraft. Finally, he turned to Gromov. His questions were technical, precise. Impact G-forces, expected landing shock, integrity of the tank's hull welds under torsional stress, the behavior of the suspension at the moment of takeoff and landing. He spoke of fuel slosh, of securing loose equipment inside the fighting compartment, of the physiological effect of brief weightlessness on a loaded stomach. Gromov answered, his own engineering mind meeting Koval's tactical one. The conversation was chilling in its clinical detail. They were discussing their own potential dismemberment and death as a systems integration problem. The rest of the crew engaged in their own rituals. Sasha, the driver, spent hours with Grom. He checked every bolt, greased every joint, tuned the engine to a purring perfection it hadn't had since leaving the factory. He was not preparing a machine for a crash. He was preparing a partner for a dance with impossible physics. Misha, the loader, secretly sewed a small, ancient, orthodox icon into the lining of his tank helmet, his lips moving in silent prayer, even as he meticulously packed and repacked the ammunition racks, securing each shell with strips of cloth. Ilya, the gunner, simply sat in his seat, eyes closed, hands moving slightly, as if operating phantom controls, visualizing the chaos that would greet them on the other side. Gromov observed them, and a crushing weight of responsibility, far greater than any he had felt before, settled upon him. These were not variables in an equation anymore. They were men with habits, fears, and quiet acts of preparation. He had reduced them to mass and velocity in his calculations, and now they were reasserting their humanity and in doing so making the impending act infinitely more real and more horrifying. The night before the test was a study in fractured silence. In the sappers' camp, men cleaned their tools pointlessly, unable to sleep, their fate tied to the crew's. In the tanker's bivouac, Koval's crew played a silent game of cards, the only sound the slap of worn paper on a crate. Gromov sat alone by the base of the ramp, running his calculations for the 1,000th time, each number now tasting like a potential death sentence. The Special Department captain observed it all, a vulture in a greatcoat, his notebook now half full. Dawn approached, cold and colorless. The crew arrived at their tank, which had been carefully positioned at the head of the muddy runway. They dressed not with ceremony, but with the deliberate practiced movements of men walking to a scaffold. They did not look at each other. They touched the cold steel of Grom one last time, then climbed in, each hatch closing with a final metallic clang that echoed in the silent clearing. The engine coughed, then roared to life, the exhaust puffing blue smoke into the pale light. The sound was aggressive, alive, a stark contrast to the waiting, silent, wooden giant ahead of it. Gromov stood at his control point, a simple raised platform with a clear view. He held a green flag in one hand, a red one in the other. His mouth was dust-dry. His entire world, his career, his sanity, and the lives of 4 men he now knew, had been distilled into this moment, into the angle of a ramp and the courage of a crew sealed inside a steel coffin. He raised the green flag. The tank's engine note climbed from a roar to a deafening, vibrating scream. The air itself seemed to tighten. The machine was no longer a tank. It was a primed cartridge. And the ramp was the barrel, waiting to fire its living shell into the unknown. The scream of the T-34's engine was not just sound. It was a physical force. It vibrated up through the muddy ground, through the soles of the watching men's boots, rattling their teeth in their skulls. The tank, Grom, ceased to be a vehicle. It became a concentration of pure, unleashed fury, trembling against its own brakes, a predator straining at the leash. Inside, the world was reduced to a deafening, diesel-thick roar and the violent shudder of every plate and gear. Lieutenant Koval's voice, calm and precise, was a ghost in their headphones, counting them down through a ritual that felt both sacred and profane. At the control platform, Major Gromov became a statue. The green flag in his hand was a forgotten object, a piece of colored cloth against the monumental reality he had authored. Time did not slow. It fractured. His vision tunneled, eliminating the forest, the pale sky, the rows of tense, grimy faces. All that existed was the trembling tank at the end of the runway and the dark, hungry maw of the ramp's inclined plane ahead of it. His mind, the elegant calculator of vectors and stresses, went blank. All that remained was a raw, animal prayer, aimed at the laws of physics. He dropped the flag. The driver, Sasha, did not release the brakes. He obliterated them. The T-34 did not roll forward. It exploded from the line. The front end lifted for a terrifying instant. The full, brutal torque of the engine trying to flip it onto its back before the tracks bit into the churned earth. Then it was a green-black avalanche, a thunderbolt on tracks. Mud and shredded vegetation fountained in its wake, a rooster tail of violence. The sound transformed from a scream into a continuous, earth-tearing roar. It accelerated with a speed that seemed impossible for its mass, a terrifying defiance of expectation. The men watching experienced a collective, visceral shock. This was not a tank maneuvering. This was a tank in the final suicidal charge of its existence, a charge with no enemy ahead, but geometry itself. The distance to the ramp, which had seemed so long during construction, vanished in a heartbeat. The impact with the ramp's base was not a transition. It was a collision, a deep, groaning crunch of wood and steel that echoed like a bone breaking. The entire structure shuddered. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the ramp would simply disintegrate on contact, swallowing the tank in a cloud of splinters. But the overbuilt timber skeleton, born of the sapper's grim pride, held. The sound morphed into a higher, protesting shriek as the tank's tracks met the treated oak of the launch track. Now the climb. The angle was steep, absurdly so. The tank's nose pointed sharply at the sky. From the side, it looked like a tank attempting to climb a vertical wall. The engine's roar, trapped and amplified by the wooden channel, became a deafening, singular note of mechanical agony. Sparks fountained from the tracks as they clawed for purchase. For 3 endless seconds, it was a contest of wills between a machine and a mountain. It seemed to slow, to hang on the precipice of failure, momentum bleeding away. Then it reached the precise apex Gromov had calculated, the end of the inclined plane. The tank did not roll off. It was ejected. The front tracks lost contact with the wood. For a fraction of a second, The entire colossal weight of the T-34 was suspended by the rear sprockets alone, a pose of impossible balletic tension. Then it was free. The roar of the engine was suddenly distant, separated from the earth. What followed was silence. Not true silence, but the shocking, relative quiet after the cataclysm of launch, filled only by the whine of spinning tracks in empty air. Grom was flying. It was a sight that bypassed the brain and struck directly at the primal core of every witness. It was wrong. It was magnificent. It was horrifying. The 30-ton steel beast, angular and lethal, was etched against the gray sky in a flat ballistic arc. It was no longer a tank. It was a geometry of war freed from the earth. Sun glinted dully off its slanted side armor. It seemed to hang for an eternity at the peak of its parabola, a dark, unnatural moon, before the nose began to tip down, obeying the ruthless pull of gravity. On the ground, the paralysis broke. A raw, involuntary gasp tore from dozens of throats. The sappers, their tools falling from limp fingers, stared open-mouthed. The Special Department captain's pencil snapped in his hand, unnoticed. Gromov did not breathe. His whole universe was that flying silhouette. His calculations were no longer numbers. They were this, and they were terrifyingly correct. The descent was faster than the ascent. The tank assumed its proper attitude, tracks down, as if seeking the earth it had abandoned. It grew larger, more detailed, more real with terrifying speed. It was not landing. It was arriving, with the force of a meteor. It struck the far bank. The impact was not a sound. It was a physical event that punched the observers in the chest. A deep subterranean thoom that was felt more than heard. A huge, dark bloom of earth, mud, and shattered vegetation erupted from the impact zone, obscuring the tank completely. The ground trembled. Fragments of soil and stone rained down for hundreds of meters around. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only the settling dust cloud and the ringing aftermath of the impact. Then, through the haze, a sound. A low, grinding, mechanical growl. The cloud, stirred by a sudden breeze, began to part. There it stood. Grom! Canted at a steep angle, buried up to its fenders in the crater of its own making, mud plastered over every surface, dripping from its barrel like black blood. But intact. A track clanked, tensioned. The engine note, ragged and strained but running. The driver's hatch flew open. Sasha's head emerged, pale and wide-eyed, coughing mud. Then the commander's cupola. Koval, blinking against the dust, looked back across the river towards his point of origin. He raised a clenched fist, a small, stark gesture in the vast silence. On the near bank, the tension shattered into a seismic release. The sappers erupted, not in cheers, but in a guttural animal roar of triumph, of disbelief, of vindication. They hugged, they pounded each other's backs, they yelled wordless sounds at the sky. The sergeant major turned to Gromov, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face, and simply nodded, a communication beyond words. Gromov did not join them. He slowly lowered himself onto the platform's wooden planks, his legs unable to support him. He stared at the smoking, mud-caked tank on the far shore. No euphoria hit him. Instead, a profound, soul-deep tremor of aftershock. He had done it. He had turned heresy into fact. He had bent the laws of reality to his will. And in that moment of supreme triumph, he understood with crystalline clarity the monstrous door he had just kicked open. This was not an end. It was a beginning. and the cost of what came next would be measured in steel and in lives. Launched into the sky. The first flight was over. The conveyor of madness was now ready to begin. The triumph of the first flight was a fragile bubble, and it burst almost immediately under the weight of harsh military necessity. The mood on the command knoll underwent a seismic shift. General Volkov's skepticism, melted away in the shock of the tank's impossible arc, was reforged into something colder and more demanding, voracious ambition. He no longer saw a mad experiment. He saw a weapon, a sudden, brutal, and utterly unexpected method of force projection. The single, miraculous parabola was not a solution to a problem. It was the blueprint for a new kind of offensive. Gromov was summoned from the euphoric sappers not to receive congratulations, but new orders. They were not requests. They were geometric and logistical facts. The single ramp, he was told, was now Launch Site Alpha. He would oversee the construction of 3 more, codenamed Beta, Gamma, and Delta, at half-kilometer intervals along the bank. The objective was no longer to prove a concept. It was to transfer an entire tank battalion, over 30 T-34s, across the river in a single, shattering wave, under the cover of an artillery barrage. The time frame was impossible. 48 hours. The engineer in Gromov understood the horrific scale of the task. The man recoiled from it. He tried to voice the dangers, the variables, the exponential increase in risk, the need for perfect synchronization, for identical ramp construction, for crews trained in a maneuver that defied all training. His words were brushed aside. The general's eyes held the hard light of a strategist who has seen a chink in the enemy's armor and is determined to drive a spearhead through it, regardless of the spear's integrity. The success of the first flight had transformed Gromov from a potential saboteur into the indispensable architect of this insanity. He was trapped by his own success. The forest forge became a scene from an industrial inferno. The focused, almost sacred effort of building the first ramp was replaced by the brutal, mechanized chaos of mass production. The sounds were no longer of careful axes and saws, but of screaming power tools rigged to generator trucks, of constant shouted orders, of trees being blown down with explosive charges to clear space for the new sites. The intimate, possessive pride of the original sapper company was diluted by the influx of hundreds of new men, combat engineers, confused infantrymen, exhausted logistics troops. They worked in rotating shifts under arc lights that turned the night into a garish, shadow-filled day, their movements driven by fear of the officers' wrath rather than belief in the project. Gromov was everywhere, a spectral figure haunting all 4 sites. He moved in a frantic, sleepless haze. His engineering mind, which had once focused on the elegant purity of a single equation, was now shredded into 1,000 screaming fragments. At Site Beta, the foundation soil was too soft. He ordered a brutal, time-consuming corduroy road of logs to be laid. At Site Gamma, the timber was of inferior green wood. He had to redesign the bracing on the spot, his calculations done on a plywood sheet with a lump of charcoal. He argued with foremen, overruled cautious suggestions, and made snap decisions that carried the weight of life and death. The obsessive craftsman was gone, replaced by a desperate production manager on the edge of collapse. And the human cost began to mount, quietly, horrifically. It was no longer just about the daring tank crews. A support beam at Site Delta, rushed into place by exhausted men, slipped during a stress test. It did not just fall. It swung like a giant's club, crushing two sappers into the mud before anyone could scream. Their bodies were dragged away, and the work, after a stunned, silent minute, resumed. No one made a speech. The conveyor could not stop. At Site Alpha, where the original ramp was being reinforced for continuous use, a tank crew rehearsing the approach misjudged their speed on the muddy runway. Their T-34 slewed sideways, its track tearing off in a shriek of tortured metal, the tank slamming into a tree line. The crew emerged shaken but alive, but their tank, Grom's sister, was out of the war. Each incident was a stark, bleeding counterpoint to the first clean flight. The tank crews themselves, the projectiles, were a separate study in mounting tension. The initial grim camaraderie of Koval's pioneers was now institutionalized into a brutal, accelerated training regimen. New volunteers, motivated by a desperate mix of bravado, fatalism, and the promise of avoiding the trenches, lined up. They practiced the acceleration run in fields far from the river, their commanders using stopwatches, hunting for the exact, terrifying sweet spot between insufficient speed and catastrophic loss of control. They sat through briefings where Gromov, his voice now a dry monotone from overuse, explained the physics of their impending flight, as if teaching a gruesome university seminar. The superstitious rituals multiplied. Men painted strange symbols on their hulls. They carried lucky charms. They wrote letters home with a new, chilling finality. Through it all, the shadow of the Special Department captain grew longer. He no longer followed just Gromov. His agents were everywhere, in the construction crews, among the tankers. The potential charge had subtly shifted from sabotage to failure to meet production quotas, and negligence leading to loss of military assets. Every accident, every delay was noted. Gromov's authority was absolute, but it was an authority balanced on a knife edge. He was driving men and machines to the breaking point, and the system was watching, coldly documenting the cracks. On the eve of the operation, standing on a hill overlooking the four ramps, four dark, skeletal fingers pointing accusingly at the enemy shore, Gromov felt no pride, only a hollow, consuming dread. The elegant, insane idea had metastasized into a monstrous military-industrial machine. He was no longer an engineer solving a problem. He was a conductor of barely controlled chaos, about to unleash a steel storm. The conveyor was built. It was rickety, bloody, and fueled by pure will. And tomorrow, it would start moving, launching not just tanks, but the last vestiges of his own humanity, into the void. Dawn did not break. It was smothered at birth. The sky over the river remained a deep, bruised purple, held in a perpetual twilight by a vast, roiling, artificial storm of smoke and dust. For 2 hours, every Soviet artillery piece within range had been vomiting fire across the Dnieper. The barrage was not aimed at specific positions. It was a geological event, a deliberate attempt to peel back the top layer of the far bank, to churn the German defenses into a chaos of noise, dirt, and shock. The air itself thrummed with a continuous basso profundo tremor, a physical pressure against the eardrums and the chest. It was the perfect acoustic and visual screen. It was the overture to madness. At the 4 launch sites, the world existed in a state of hyper-real, silent film terror. The thunder of the guns was so immense, it created its own surreal silence close to the ground. Men moved with frantic purpose, their shouts swallowed before they left their lips. The only clear sounds were the metallic, intimate ones, the clang of a hatch, the cough of a diesel engine turning over, the sharp, nervous commands of platoon leaders conveyed by hand signals. Major Gromov stood at the central command post, a sandbagged platform linked to the sites by field telephone lines that snaked away into the gloom. He was the still, silent center of the hurricane. His eyes were red-rimmed craters, his face gray with a fatigue so deep it looked like illness. In his hands, he held not blueprints or calculations, but a simple field watch and a status board with wooden pegs representing each tank. His engineering was done. Now he was a timing mechanism, the conductor. At each ramp, the first tank in line revved its engine, exhaust plumes glowing faintly in the chemical haze. These were not the carefully prepared volunteers of the test flight. These were combat-loaded machines of war, their steel flanks festooned with extra track links, draped with bedrolls, heavy with full ammunition racks and fuel drums. They sat heavier, lower, more deadly. Their crews were sealed inside, isolated in their own private universes of fear, wrapped in the smell of oil, cordite, and cold sweat. A green flare arced high over the river, slicing through the smoke. The signal. At Site Alpha, the first tank lurched forward. It was not Grom, but another, its driver guided by the remembered path of the pioneer. The sequence began, a brutal rhythmic ballet of violence, the roar of an engine at the absolute limit of its endurance, rising to a crescendo as it hit the ramp, the grotesque splintering groan of wood under titanic stress. A moment of suspension, the tank becoming a stark, angular silhouette against the mustard-yellow smoke of the barrage. Then the arc, a perfect, repeating parabola of steel, one after another, like shells from a monstrous, slow-firing artillery battery. But from Gromov's vantage point, the perfect geometry quickly dissolved into the chaos of reality. The conveyor was not a precision instrument. It was a stressed organism. At Site Beta, the third tank in line hit a patch of mud churned to soup by the vehicles ahead. Its tracks lost purchase. It veered off the runway, its momentum carrying it in a sickening, slow-motion skid into the support structure of the ramp itself. The collision was a dull, crushing explosion of wood and metal. The ramp shuddered, visibly sagging. The following tanks screeched to a halt, trapped in a snarled, chaotic queue. The site was dead. Panicked figures swarmed around the wreck. At Site Gamma, a tank launched perfectly, but the cumulative stress on the hastily built structure proved too much. As the next tank began its run, a critical lateral support, fatigued from the repeated impacts, gave way with a sound like a cannon shot. The launch track twisted, collapsing sideways. The accelerating T-34 hit the deformed incline and was hurled off the side like a toy, tumbling down the embankment in a catastrophic rending of steel before coming to rest on its turret. A motionless, smoking wreck. A secondary explosion of ammunition lit the scene in a brief, horrific, orange flash. Gromov received the reports via the crackling field phone, each one a ice pick to his heart. His responses were mechanical, devoid of emotion. Abandon Beta. Redirect to Alpha and Delta. Increase interval to 90 seconds. He moved pegs on his board from the ready column to the lost column. The numbers were no longer abstractions. They were men and machines being fed into a flawed equation. Yet, where the ramps held, the effect was transcendent, world-altering. From the German perspective on the far bank, those few not concussed or hiding deep in bunkers, the horror was incomprehensible. Through the smoke and hellish noise of the barrage, shapes began to emerge. Not boats, not men, not planes. Huge, dark, low-flying projectiles screaming out of the gloom, materializing from nowhere. They landed not at the water's edge, but behind the first line of trenches, behind the machine gun nests. They landed with earth-shattering force, and then, impossibly, they moved. Their hatches flew open, disgorging dazed but furious Soviet infantry who had crossed in small boats under the cover of the chaos. The T-34s, shaking off the impact like stunned bulls, began to fire point-blank into trenches, into log bunkers, into the rear of positions designed to face an attack from the river. The bridgehead was not established. It was teleported. It appeared in a dozen scattered, cratered locations across a kilometer of front, a simultaneous internal hemorrhage in the German line. The psychological shock was absolute, paralyzing. The defenders were prepared for a crossing. They were not prepared for an aerial insertion of armor. Gromov watched through binoculars, his hands steady only because they were locked in a death grip on the railing. He saw the tiny distant figures of tanks, his tanks, moving and firing on the far bank. He saw the flashes of explosions that were not impacts, but their guns speaking. A strange, hollow feeling filled him. It was working. The tactic was breaking the enemy, and it was consuming his creations, his men, at a terrifying rate. The conveyor, though battered and bleeding, was delivering its payload. As the sun finally began to burn through the haze, the operation reached its brutal climax. The last operable tank from Site Alpha, its side scarred from a near miss with the collapsing structure at Gamma, made its run. It launched, a solitary, brave arc against a now clearing sky. It landed, joining the scattered, ferocious battle on the opposite shore. Silence descended on the near bank, not true silence, but the absence of the launch screams and the colossal barrage. The smoke began to drift, revealing the scars. 2 of the 4 ramps were shattered, grotesque piles of splintered timber. One was damaged but standing, a monument to near failure. The 4th stood intact, smoking gently from friction-heated wood. The ground was a churned wasteland of mud, tracks, and debris. Wrecked tanks lay where they had fallen. Medics tended to the injured sappers. Gromov lowered his binoculars. The field telephone was silent. His status board told the story. Over 30 pegs launched. At least a third in the lost column. The cost was engraved in the landscape and in the missing faces of his men. The steel avalanche had been unleashed. It had carved a bloody foothold from sheer, shocking will. On the far bank, the battle roared on, now a conventional fight. But here, at the point of origin, there was only the wreckage of the idea, and the man who had conceived it, standing amidst the ruins of his own terrible ingenuity. The flight was over. The war had moved on, leaving only the shattered ramps and the ghosts of flying tanks behind. The battle for the bridgehead was won. The official reports, already being typed on heavy typewriters far behind the lines, would speak of a daring and innovative crossing operation, of the heroic tenacity of our tank crews and infantry, of a brilliant tactical maneuver that decisively outflanked enemy defenses. The river was no longer an obstacle. Regular pontoon bridges, now secure from targeted fire, were being assembled with efficient, boring normalcy. A steady, unremarkable flow of men, trucks, and artillery was moving across, expanding the foothold into a solid front. The war, a vast, consuming organism, had digested the shock of the flying tanks and moved on. Its hunger focused on the next river, the next town, the next German defensive line. Major Viktor Gromov remained on the western bank. He was ordered to stay, to oversee the dismantling of experimental equipment and compile a technical report. It was a polite form of exile, a way to keep the architect of madness away from the parade grounds and the distribution of medals. His war for the moment was over. He walked alone through the remains of his creation. The sites were being cleared not by his sappers, who had been reassigned to the bridging units, but by a rear echelon labor battalion. They worked without passion, breaking apart the mighty ramps with crowbars and axes, feeding the splintered timber into roaring bonfires. The scent of victory here was not cordite and diesel, but wood smoke and wet ash. The colossal skeletal frames that had defied physics were being reduced to kindling, their purpose already fading into anecdote. Gromov stopped at the crater left by the first flight, Grom's landing scar. It was already filling with muddy water, a shallow, unremarkable pond. He tried to feel the echo of that impact, the moment of his supreme triumph and terror. But there was nothing. The ground had absorbed the violence and forgotten it. He encountered the survivors, and in their eyes he saw the fragmented cost. A group of tankers, their battalion mauled but victorious, was loading onto trucks, heading back for refit. Lieutenant Koval was not among them. He had died 2 days after the landing, not in his tank, but to a random mortar shell while scouting on foot. His crew was scattered, wounded, transferred. The sergeant major of the sappers found Gromov, not to reminisce, but to formally return a borrowed theodolite. His handshake was firm, his gaze steady, but he spoke of the men they had lost to the collapsing beams and misjudged speeds with a flat, administrative tone. They were not heroes of a novel exploit. They were irrecoverable losses incurred during special engineering works. The bureaucratic machine was already sanitizing the madness. The final meeting was with the special department captain. It took place not in a command tent, but in the open, by the smoldering remains of Site Gamma. The captain's notebook was full. He did not speak of sabotage or treason. He spoke of material expenditures versus tactical gain, of non-standard resource allocation, and personnel casualties during testing phases. His conclusion was delivered not as a threat, but as a clinical finding. Major Gromov's methods, while achieving a tactical surprise, were deemed resource inefficient and personnel intensive for wider application. His engineering zeal, the report would note, had occasionally overridden prudent safety protocols. There was no court-martial. There was no medal. There was a transfer. Effective immediately, Major Gromov was to report to the rear, to a research institute in the Ural Mountains. His new task? To theoretically refine and document advanced crossing methodologies. It was a prison of paper and theory. The message was clear. The Army needed his mind, but it feared his ideas. He was to be studied, contained, and prevented from ever again bending the rigid framework of warfare with such reckless, concrete imagination. On his last morning, before being driven away in a staff car, Gromov took one final walk. He stood on the riverbank, looking at the now bustling pontoon bridge, the orderly, predictable flow of power it represented. Then he turned his back to it. He faced the single, remaining intact ramp. Site Delta. The Labor Battalion had not yet reached it. It stood alone against the gray sky, a silent, empty giant. Its launch track was scarred and blackened by the tracks of the last tanks that had ridden it into the sky. It pointed nowhere now, a monument to a moment of impossible vector that had already passed into history. Gromov approached it. He placed his hand on one of the massive, soot-stained uprights. The wood was cold and solid. He remembered the vibration, the scream, the arc. He saw not a triumph, but the faces of the dead sappers, the twisted wreck of the tank at Gamma, Koval's missing face. His idea had worked. It had changed the local course of a battle, and it had exacted a brutal, precise price, which he alone seemed to fully remember. He did not see a brilliant invention. He saw a tool of terrifying, specific desperation, born from a unique confluence of river, enemy, and time pressure. It was not the future of war. It was a freak, a magnificent and terrible one-off. The staff car horn sounded, a short, impatient bleat. Gromov removed his hand from the timber. He turned and walked towards the car, not looking back. He left the ramp standing. Let them burn it. Let it rot. Its purpose was served. The vehicle drove east, away from the front. In the distance, the first flakes of a late autumn snow began to fall, silently covering the mud, the tank tracks, the scars, beginning the process of burying the evidence of the flying tanks under a clean, forgetful white.